The dusty trail between Widow's Creek and the Henderson homestead had seen the same small figure every dawn for 3 months running. 12-year-old Jake Henderson carried 2 heavy water buckets across 5 miles of unforgiving Texas prairie, his mother's labored breathing echoing in his mind with every step. The consumption was winning, and the nearest doctor was 2 towns over with fees Jake could never afford. What the boy didn't know was that his father hadn't died in a cattle drive accident like his mother claimed. Jacob Henderson Sr. had been the most feared gunslinger in 3 states before he hung up his holsters for love. Now, as Jake's small hands blistered raw from rope handles, the richest man in Millbrook County, Samuel Blackwood, watched from his mansion window. Blackwood knew exactly who the boy was, and why his father's enemies would pay handsomely for that information. When Blackwood's black stallion appeared beside Jake that morning, offering help, the boy had no idea he was accepting a deal with the devil himself. But what did Blackwood really want with a dying woman's son? The sun barely kissed the horizon when Jake's worn boots hit the packed earth outside their one-room cabin. His mother's coughing had kept him awake most of the night, each violent spasm rattling the thin walls like thunder. He'd counted the intervals between her fits of breathing. They were getting shorter. The empty buckets felt light in his hands as he began the familiar trek, but he knew the return journey would test every muscle in his small frame. His stomach growled, reminding him that yesterday's meager portion of beans had been his last real meal. The chickens had stopped laying weeks ago, and their old cow had dried up from lack of proper feed. Jake paused at Miller's Ridge, where the trail curved toward Widow's Creek. From here, he could see the sprawling Blackwood estate in the distance, its white columns gleaming like ivory tusks against the red clay landscape. Smoke curled from multiple chimneys, and Jake wondered what it would be like to never worry about water, food, or medicine. The creek ran shallow this time of year, forcing Jake to wade deeper than usual to fill his buckets. The water was clear enough, though he'd heard tell of cattle drinking upstream. It would have to do. Everything would have to do until his mother got better, if she got better. As he hefted the full buckets and began his return journey, the weight immediately pulled at his shoulders. Water sloshed over the rims despite his careful steps, each lost drop representing precious liquid his mother needed. Dr. Morrison had mentioned something about keeping consumption patients hydrated, back when they could still afford his visits. The sound of hoofbeats made Jake freeze. Riders were rare on this stretch of trail, especially at dawn. He set down his buckets and squinted against the rising sun. A lone horseman approached on a magnificent black stallion, the kind of horse Jake had only seen in his dreams. Samuel Blackwood cut an imposing figure even at a distance. His black suit was tailored perfectly, his silver hair gleaming beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Everything about the man spoke of wealth and power, from his polished boots to the gold chain across his vest. "Well now," Blackwood said, reining in his stallion beside Jake. "You must be the Henderson boy I've been hearing about." Jake nodded warily, unsure why the richest man in the county would know his name. "Yes, sir, Jake Henderson." Blackwood's pale blue eyes studied the boy with unsettling intensity. "That's quite a load for someone your size. 5 miles each way, I'm told." "Yes, sir. My mother needs the water." Jake's voice was steady despite his nervousness. "Consumption is a terrible thing," Blackwood said, dismounting with fluid grace. "I lost my own dear wife to it years ago. Tell me, boy, how is your mother faring?" The genuine concern in Blackwood's voice caught Jake off guard. She's fighting, sir, but the medicine's expensive and we—" "Say no more." Blackwood raised a gloved hand. "I may be able to help with that situation." Jake's heart leaped. "Really, sir?" Samuel Blackwood didn't become the wealthiest rancher in 3 counties by ignoring opportunities to help my neighbors. The man's smile seemed warm, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. "I could have my men deliver fresh water to your homestead daily. And I have connections with doctors who might treat your mother without the usual financial constraints." It sounded too good to be true. Jake had learned to be suspicious of gifts, but desperation made him bold. "What would you want in return, Mr. Blackwood?" "Smart boy, your father raised you right." Blackwood's smile widened. "Just a small favor. I need someone trustworthy to run errands, carry messages. Light work for someone already accustomed to walking long distances." Jake glanced at his heavy buckets, then back at Blackwood's kind face. His mother's labored breathing seemed to whisper from the wind itself. "When would I start, sir?" The wooden bucket felt heavier with each step back toward the ramshackle cabin that Thomas called home. Water sloshed against the sides, precious drops escaping to darken the dust at his feet. He quickened his pace, knowing his mother would be waiting, her fever making her lips crack like dried riverbed clay. The cabin sat alone, on a worthless patch of land his father had claimed before a rattlesnake took him 3 years back. What had once been ambitious dreams of cattle ranching had withered into a daily struggle for survival. The roof leaked, the walls groaned in strong winds, and the well had run dry 2 months ago when the drought settled over the territory like a curse. Thomas pushed through the door, its hinges protesting with a metallic shriek. Inside, the air hung thick and stifling. His mother lay on the narrow bed, her breathing shallow and labored. Sarah McKenna had once been the prettiest woman in 3 counties, with auburn hair that caught sunlight like spun copper. Now that same hair lay matted against a pillow stained with sweat and time. "Mama?" Thomas knelt beside the bed, dipping a torn piece of cloth into the bucket. "I brought fresh water." Her eyes fluttered open, green as spring grass but dimmed by illness. "Tommy," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "you're a good boy." He pressed the damp cloth to her forehead, watching her face relax slightly at the cool touch. The fever had been climbing for days now, and Thomas knew with growing desperation that water alone wouldn't save her. She needed medicine, a real doctor, things that cost money he didn't have. "Rest now," he murmured, but her hand caught his wrist with surprising strength. "The land," she said, her grip tightening. "Don't let them take the land, Tommy. Your father, he died for this place." Thomas nodded, though they both knew the property was more burden than blessing. Still, it was all they had left of his father's dreams. "I won't let anyone take it, Mama, I promise." She released his wrist and closed her eyes, her breathing evening out as sleep claimed her again. Thomas sat back on his heels, studying her face in the dim light filtering through the single window. Each day she grew thinner, more fragile, like she was slowly fading away before his eyes. A shadow fell across the doorway, and Thomas spun around to find a man silhouetted against the afternoon sun. The stranger was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing clothes that spoke of wealth and authority. A silver watch chain glinted across his vest, and his boots were polished to a mirror shine despite the dusty terrain. "Thomas McKenna?" The man's voice carried the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Who's asking?" Thomas rose slowly, positioning himself between the stranger and his mother's bed. "Name's Clayton Blackwood." The man stepped into the cabin uninvited, his presence somehow making the small space feel even more cramped. "I own the Circle B Ranch, biggest spread in the territory." Thomas had heard the name whispered in town with a mixture of respect and fear. Blackwood controlled more land and cattle than any man had a right to, and his influence reached into every corner of the county. "What do you want?" Blackwood's gaze swept over the cabin's meager contents before settling on the woman in the bed. "Heard your mother's taken ill. Heard you've been making quite a journey every day just to fetch water." "Ooh, Wanage," Thomas said, his jaw tightening. "Do you?" Blackwood's smile held no warmth. "Because from where I stand, it looks like you're barely hanging on. How long since she's seen a proper doctor?" The question hit like a physical blow. Thomas had been asking himself the same thing every day, watching his mother waste away while he remained powerless to help her. That's our business. It could be mine. Blackwood moved closer, and Thomas caught the scent of expensive tobacco and leather. I have a proposition for you, boy. Something that could save your mother's life. Despite himself, Thomas felt a flicker of hope. What kind of proposition? The kind that requires a man's handshake and his word. Blackwood glanced toward the bed where Sarah McKenna lay unconscious. I can have a doctor here within the hour. Best medical man in 3 territories. I can provide medicine, food, whatever she needs to recover. Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs. In exchange for what? Blackwood's smile widened, revealing teeth as white and sharp as a wolf's. A simple job, boy. One task that'll set your family up for life. He paused, letting the words sink in. Course, if you're not interested, I understand. Some folks prefer their pride over their family's welfare. The cruel truth of it settled over Thomas like a weight. His mother was dying, and this man held the power to save her. Whatever price Blackwood demanded, how could he refuse? What kind of job? Thomas asked quietly. The morning sun carved harsh shadows across the dusty main street as Jake hefted the water buckets onto his shoulders. His boots had barely touched the weathered planks of the general store's porch when a voice called out behind him. Boy! Jake turned to find Augustus Whitmore emerging from the shadows of the alley between buildings, his silver-tipped walking cane tapping against the wooden walkway. The rancher's presence here, away from his sprawling estate on the hill, sent an uncomfortable chill down Jake's spine. Mr. Whitmore. Jake's grip tightened on the bucket handles. Walk with me. It wasn't a request. They moved down the street together, Whitmore's measured pace forcing Jake to slow his usual urgent stride. The older man's keen eyes surveyed the town like a general inspecting his territory, which Jake supposed wasn't far from the truth. Half the businesses here owed their existence to Whitmore's patronage. Tell me about your mother's condition, Whitmore said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his questions answered. Jake's jaw clenched. She's holding on. That's not what I asked. Whitmore stopped walking and fixed Jake with a stare that seemed to pierce straight through him. Dr. Henderson tells me she needs medicine. Expensive medicine. The mention of the doctor's name hit Jake like a physical blow. He should have known the 2 men would talk. Henderson had been pressing Jake about payment for weeks, growing more insistent each time he visited the cabin. I'll find a way to pay him, Jake said, though the words felt hollow even to his own ears. With what? Whitmore's laugh was dry as desert wind. You barely earn enough hauling water and odd jobs to keep food on your table. At this rate, she'll be dead before you save enough for even 1 bottle of the laudanum she needs. The brutal honesty stung, partly because it was true. Jake had been lying awake nights, calculating and recalculating the meager coins in his jar against the mounting cost of his mother's care. The numbers never added up. What do you want? Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Whitmore smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Smart boy. I want you to work for me. Real work, not the child's errands you've been running around town. What kind of work? The kind that pays well enough to keep your mother comfortable. Whitmore resumed walking, leading them toward the edge of town where his black carriage waited. I have business interests that require discreet handling, men who understand the value of loyalty and silence. Jake's stomach twisted. Everyone in Clearwater knew Whitmore's wealth came from more than just cattle. There were whispers about his dealings with rustlers, about homesteaders who mysteriously abandoned their claims after visits from his men, about shipments that moved through town under cover of darkness. I'm not a killer, Jake said. Did I say anything about killing? Whitmore's tone was mild, almost amused. though a man in my position does occasionally find himself in need of protection. The frontier can be dangerous after all. They reached the carriage, and Whitmore's driver, a hard-faced man with a gun belt slung low on his hips, nodded respectfully to his employer. Jake recognized him as one of the men who'd been watching him the day before. "Think about it," Whitmore said, climbing into the carriage. "But don't think too long. Your mother doesn't have time for extended deliberation. And if I say no?" Whitmore leaned forward, his pale eyes glittering in the morning light. "Then you continue as you are, watching her waste away while you scramble for pennies. Dr. Henderson will eventually stop coming when his bills go unpaid. The general store will cut off your credit. And when winter comes—" He shrugged eloquently. Jake felt the weight of the water buckets dragging at his shoulders, a physical reminder of his daily struggle against time and poverty. In the distance, smoke rose from the chimney of his cabin, where his mother lay waiting for relief that might never come. "What exactly would you want me to do?" "Small things at first, delivering messages, keeping your eyes and ears open around town, learning who can be trusted and who—" Whitmore's smile turned predatory. "Who cannot?" The carriage began to move, rolling slowly down the rutted street. Whitmore called out through the window as they pulled away, "Come to the ranch tomorrow at sunset if you're interested. Don't come at all if you're not prepared to see this through to the end." Jake stood alone in the settling dust, the weight of the water buckets nothing compared to the weight of the choice pressing down on him. In the distance, his mother's cabin waited, and inside, time continued its relentless countdown. He had less than 24 hours to decide whether to save her soul by damning his own. The pre-dawn darkness wrapped around Ezra like a familiar shroud as he made his way to the stable, his boots crunching softly on the frost-covered ground. Sleep had eluded him most of the night, his mind churning over Silas Blackwood's proposition. The memory of those pale eyes studying him lingered like smoke in his thoughts, along with the weight of the gold, coins, now hidden beneath a loose floorboard in their cabin. His horse, a weathered bay mare named Dust, nickered softly as he approached. She was getting thin too, he noticed with a pang of guilt. There wasn't enough feed for her either, but she never complained, just carried him faithfully on his daily trek to the river. He ran his hand along her neck, feeling the sharp ridge of her spine. "Just a little longer, girl," he whispered. "Things might be changing soon." The ride to the river felt different this morning. Usually, Ezra found solace in the rhythm of Dust's hooves and the gradual lightening of the sky, but today anxiety gnawed at his stomach like hunger. Blackwood's words echoed in his memory. There are things that need doing. And you strike me as a young man who understands necessity." What kind of things? And why him, when Blackwood had dozens of experienced hands working his spread? The river came into view as the sun crested the eastern hills, painting the water silver gold. Ezra dismounted and grabbed the wooden buckets, but as he approached the bank, he froze. Fresh horse tracks marked the mud, several sets and recent. His hand instinctively moved to the old Navy Colt at his hip, a relic from his father's army days that he'd learned to use hunting rabbits and coyotes. "Easy there, boy." Ezra spun toward the voice, his heart hammering. 3 men emerged from behind a cluster of cottonwoods, and he recognized them immediately. The Murphy brothers, Cleet, Virgil, and young Tommy, worked for Samuel Morrison, whose ranch bordered the Blackwood spread. They were known troublemakers, the kind who found entertainment in other people's misery. Cleet, the eldest and meanest, grinned as he stepped closer. "Heard you had yourself a meeting with the big man yesterday. Word travels fast in a small town." "Don't know what you're talking about," Ezra replied, though his voice came out rougher than intended. He kept his hand near his gun but didn't draw. 3 against 1 were poor odds, especially when the 3 had the look of men spoiling for a fight. "Sure you do," Virgil chimed in, moving to flank Ezra's left. Blackwood don't invite just anybody to his office. Must be something special about you." Tommy, barely older than Ezra himself, hung back but kept his eyes fixed on the buckets. Maybe he's got something hidden away, something worth Blackwood's attention. The implication hit Ezra like a physical blow. If word had already spread about his meeting with Blackwood, how long before people started asking questions about his family's sudden change in fortune? How long before someone came looking for answers at their cabin where his mother lay defenseless? "I don't have anything you'd want," Ezra said, taking a careful step backward toward the river. "And I don't have time for games." Cleet's grin widened, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "See, that's where you're wrong, boy. Morrison's been wondering what Blackwood's up to, and you just became mighty interesting. Maybe you could share what you two discussed. Maybe you could go to hell." The words were out before Ezra could stop them. Cleet's expression darkened, and Ezra knew he'd made a mistake. But he was tired, bone-deep tired of being pushed around, of watching his mother waste away, of being treated like dirt because they were poor. "Wrong answer," Cleet snarled, and his hand dropped to his gun. Ezra drew faster than he'd ever drawn in his life, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought failed. The Navy Colt cleared leather just as Cleet's weapon rose, and for a heartbeat that felt like eternity, the two men faced each other with iron in their hands. "Hold it right there." The sharp command cracked across the morning air like a whip. All four men turned to see a rider approaching at a gallop. Deputy Marshal Jake Henley, his badge glinting in the early sunlight. The lawman's own weapon was already drawn, though he kept it pointed skyward. "Everybody just ease those guns down real slow," Henley called as he reined in his horse. His eyes swept the scene, taking in the positions, the tension crackling between the groups. "Cleet Murphy, I might have known. You boys looking for trouble this early in the day?" Cleet's jaw worked like he wanted to spit, but he slowly holstered his pistol. "Just having a friendly conversation with young Thorne here, Marshal. No harm in that." Henley's weathered face showed he wasn't buying it for a second. Funny kind of conversation that requires drawn iron. "I think you boys had better head on back to the Morrison place." The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty ground as Jake made his way toward the well, the empty water jug heavy in his hands despite containing nothing but air and his growing dread. 3 days had passed since his meeting with Cornelius Blackwood, and the weight of the decision pressed down on him like a stone in his chest. His mother's condition had worsened overnight, her fever climbing higher despite his desperate attempts to cool her burning skin with damp cloths. As he approached the town square, Jake noticed something different. A crowd had gathered near the sheriff's office, their voices carrying an edge of excitement and fear. He slowed his pace, straining to catch fragments of conversation that drifted on the morning breeze. "Found him face down in Willow Creek," someone was saying. 3 bullet holes, clean as you please. "That's the 3rd one this month," another voice replied. "Always the same. Men who crossed Blackwood, ending up dead." Jake's blood turned to ice water in his veins. He ducked behind a wagon, pressing his back against the rough wooden slats as he listened to the townspeople discuss the latest victim. The name meant nothing to him, but the pattern was becoming clear. Those who opposed Cornelius Blackwood had a tendency to meet unfortunate ends. Sheriff Morrison emerged from his office, his weathered face grim as he addressed the crowd. "Now, folks, we don't have any evidence linking Mr. Blackwood to these deaths. Could be cattle rustlers, could be drifters. Best we all mind our own business and let the law handle this." A bitter laugh escaped from someone in the crowd. "What law, Sheriff? The kind that comes with Blackwood's monthly envelope?" Morrison's hand moved instinctively toward his gun belt, but he seemed to think better of it. Instead, he retreated back into his office, slamming the door behind him. The crowd began to disperse, their conversations dropping to worried whispers. Jake remained hidden until the square emptied, his mind racing. The offer Blackwood had made suddenly seemed less like salvation and more like a deal with the devil himself. But as he thought of his mother's labored breathing and the way her skin had taken on a waxy pallor, he knew he was running out of choices. At the well, he found Doc Henderson drawing water for his own needs. The older man looked up as Jake approached, his kind eyes taking in the young cowboy's haggard appearance. "You look like hell, son," Doc said, not unkindly. "When's the last time you slept?" Jake shrugged, lowering his jug into the well. "Sleep's a luxury I can't afford right now." Doc studied him for a long moment, then glanced around to ensure they were alone. "I heard Blackwood paid you a visit the other day. Word travels fast in a town this size." The rope slipped in Jake's hands, nearly sending his jug plummeting to the bottom of the well. He hauled it back up with shaking fingers. "Don't know what you mean." "Son, I've been doctoring in this town for 23 years. I've seen what happens to folks who get tangled up with Cornelius Blackwood. Whatever he's offering, it ain't worth the price you'll pay." Jake secured the rope and began hauling up his filled jug. "And what about the price I'm paying now? What about my mother?" Doc's expression softened. "There might be another way. I've been corresponding with a colleague in Denver about your mother's condition. There's a new treatment, experimental, but it's shown promise. If we could get her to the city." "With what money?" Jake's voice cracked with desperation. "I can barely afford to keep her in clean water, let alone travel to Denver. The railroad's hiring. Good wages for men willing to work the dangerous sections. It would mean leaving your mother for a few weeks, but the pay would be enough to get her proper treatment." Jake lifted the heavy jug from the well, water sloshing over the sides. "She doesn't have a few weeks, Doc. Hell, she might not have a few days." Doc Henderson reached out and placed a weathered hand on Jake's shoulder. "Sometimes the hardest choice is trusting that there's still good in this world, even when everything seems dark. Don't let desperation make you into something you're not." As Jake walked away from the well, Doc's words echoed in his mind, warring with the memory of his mother's fevered whispers and Blackwood's confident smile. The sun climbed higher, beating down mercilessly on the dusty streets, and with each step toward home, Jake felt the weight of decision pressing closer. By the time he reached the small cabin, his mind was made up. He would give his mother the water, tend to her as best he could, and when night fell, he would ride out to Blackwood's ranch. Whatever the true cost of the man's help, Jake was prepared to pay it. Some prices, he realized, couldn't be counted in dollars and cents. The sun hadn't yet crested the eastern hills when Jake heard the horses approaching. 3 riders, moving fast through the pre-dawn darkness, their hoofbeats echoing off the canyon walls like gunshots. He pressed himself against the rock face, clutching the water jug to his chest, and watched them thunder past on the trail below. Valdez's men had to be. Jake waited until the sound faded before emerging from his hiding spot. The secret spring bubbled peacefully in its hidden alcove, untouched by the violence that seemed to follow him everywhere now. He filled his jug with trembling hands, his mind racing. If Valdez's riders were out this early, it meant something had gone wrong. The ride back to the cabin felt like an eternity. Every shadow could hide an ambush, every sound might herald his doom. But Jake pressed on, driven by the image of his mother's fevered face and the promise he'd made to keep her alive. She was awake when he arrived, propped up against her pillow with what little strength remained. The sight of her sparked both relief and despair in Jake's chest. Relief that she'd made it through another night. Despair at how much weaker she looked. "You're late," she whispered, managing a wan smile. "I was starting to worry." Jake poured the cool water into a cup, his hands steadier now that he was home. "Had to take the long way. Valdez has men out." His mother's eyes sharpened, despite her condition. "What aren't you telling me, Jacob?" Before he could answer, another sound reached them, a single horse approaching at a measured pace. Jake's hand instinctively moved to his father's old colt, But the rider that appeared in their doorway wasn't one of Valdez's thugs. It was Elijah Thornton. The old rancher dismounted slowly, his weathered face grave. He removed his hat as he approached the cabin, and Jake noticed his gun hand stayed well clear of his weapon. "Mrs. Morrison," Thornton said with genuine respect, nodding to Jake's mother. "Son." His eyes found Jake's. "We need to talk." Jake's mother struggled to sit up straighter. "Mr. Thornton, this is unexpected." "Yes, ma'am. I apologize for the early hour." Thornton's voice carried a weight that made Jake's stomach clench. "But there's been developments that can't wait." "What kind of developments?" Jake asked, though he already suspected the answer. Thornton pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. "Valdez sent this to my ranch last night. Seems he's figured out our arrangement." He handed the paper to Jake, who unfolded it with dread. The message was brief but clear. "Your boy killed 3 of my men. Our business is concluded. He's mine now, Data." Jake's mother gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "Killed? Jacob, what is this man talking about?" The weight of the lie crushed down on Jake's shoulders. He'd hoped to spare her this knowledge, to let her die in peace without knowing what her son had become. But Valdez had stolen even that small mercy. "I didn't have a choice, Ma," he said quietly. "They came to collect Thornton's debt. They were going to hurt people." "What debt?" Her voice was barely a whisper. Thornton cleared his throat. "The medicine your son's been giving you, ma'am. It's not from any traveling doctor. I've been providing it, along with other assistants." The truth hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Jake watched his mother's face as understanding dawned, saw the exact moment her heart broke. "Oh, Jacob," she breathed, "what have you done?" "What I had to do to keep you alive." The words came out harsher than he intended, born of desperation and guilt. "You were dying, Ma. You still are. I couldn't just watch it happen." Thornton stepped forward. "There might be a way out of this, son, but it'll require trust on both sides." Jake laughed bitterly. "More of your help? Look where the last bit got us." "This is different." Thornton's eyes were steady, serious. "Valdez wants blood, but he wants his gold more. There's a way to give him both without you ending up in the ground." "I won't have any more killing done in my name," Jake's mother said firmly, some of her old strength returning. "I won't have my son's soul damned for a few more days of life." "It's not about killing," Thornton replied. "It's about justice. And maybe, if we play this right, about giving a dying woman the peace she deserves." Jake looked between them, torn. Every instinct screamed not to trust Thornton further, but the alternatives were stark: run and let his mother die alone, or stay and face Valdez's inevitable vengeance. "What do you have in mind?" he asked finally. Thornton's smile was grim but determined. "We're going to rob a bank." The words settled over the cabin like dust after a gunfight, heavy and final. Outside, the sun finally crested the hills, painting the world in shades of gold and blood. The gunshot echoed across the valley like thunder, and Jake's world tilted sideways. Samuel Garrett crumpled to his knees, clutching his shoulder as blood seeped between his fingers. Behind him, 3 riders emerged from the cottonwoods, their faces masked by bandanas, rifles glinting in the afternoon sun. "Should have minded your own business, old man," the lead rider called out, his voice muffled but familiar. Jake's blood ran cold as he recognized the build, the way the man sat his horse. It was Fletcher, Whitmore's foreman. Jake's hand instinctively moved toward his holstered Colt, but Garrett's sharp whistle stopped him. The old rancher's eyes, though pained, held a warning that said clearer than words. "Not yet." "Fletcher," Garrett said through gritted teeth, struggling to stay upright. "Whitmore's got you doing his dirty work in broad daylight now?" The masked rider laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Don't know what you're talking about," Far as anyone knows, you had an unfortunate encounter with bandits while riding alone. Tragic, really. There's a witness." Garrett nodded toward Jake, who felt his throat constrict. "Boy's gonna have an accident too. Shame how dangerous these trails can be." Jake's mind raced. 3 guns against 2, and Garrett was wounded. The water barrel lay forgotten beside the well, its contents slowly seeping into the thirsty earth. His mother's face flashed before him, pale, fevered, waiting for him to return. If he died here, she'd die alone. But as Fletcher raised his rifle, something shifted inside Jake. The fear didn't disappear, but it transformed into something harder, more focused. His father's words echoed in his memory. "A man's got to decide what he's willing to die for, son. Once he knows that, living gets a whole lot simpler." "You know what your problem is, Fletcher?" Jake called out, his voice steadier than he felt. "You talk too damn much." In one fluid motion, Jake rolled behind the stone well as Fletcher's shot splintered the wooden bucket. His Colt cleared leather faster than he'd ever drawn before, muscle memory and desperation combining into deadly precision. The first shot took Fletcher clean through the chest, toppling him from his saddle. The other 2 riders wheeled their horses, caught off guard by Jake's speed. One got off a wild shot that ricocheted off the well stones. Jake's second bullet found its mark, spinning the shooter around before he crashed to the ground. The third man had had enough. He spurred his horse hard, racing for the tree line, but Garrett's rifle spoke from behind Jake. The fleeing rider jerked once and kept riding, disappearing into the cottonwoods, likely carrying lead, but still breathing. Silence settled over the clearing like dust after a whirlwind. Jake's ears rang from the gunfire, and he could smell the acrid bite of powder smoke. His hands were shaking now, the enormity of what had just happened crashing over him like a cold wave. "You did good, boy," Garrett said, his voice weak but proud. "Real good." Jake holstered his gun and rushed to the old rancher's side. The bullet had torn through Garrett's shoulder, missing bone but bleeding freely. "We need to get you to Doc Morrison." "In a minute." Garrett's weathered hand gripped Jake's arm with surprising strength. "First, you need to understand what just happened here, what it means." Jake looked at the bodies sprawled in the dirt, at Fletcher's lifeless eyes staring at the sky. "Whitmore sent them. Whitmore's been trying to buy me out for years. When I wouldn't sell, he started playing rougher. Killed my cattle, poisoned my water, ran off my hands. This was supposed to be the final play." Garrett winced as he shifted position. "But you changed all that." "What do you mean?" "Fletcher's dead, and the third man saw you gun him down. Word's gonna spread that Samuel Garrett's got himself a real gunfighter riding for him. Whitmore's gonna have to think twice now before making another move." The weight of it settled on Jake's shoulders. He'd come here for water and somehow found himself in the middle of a range war, but looking at Garrett's grateful face, thinking of his mother waiting at home, he realized some choices made themselves. "Mr. Garrett," Jake said slowly, "about that job offer." The old rancher smiled despite his pain. 40 a month, found, and all the water you can carry. But Jake, his expression grew serious, "Whitmore won't let this stand. He'll come harder next time, and he'll come for you specifically. You sure you want this fight?" Jake thought of Fletcher's cold laughter, of the casual way he'd planned to murder them both. He thought of all the other desperate folks who might need Garrett's help, who might face Whitmore's guns if good men did nothing. "I'm sure," he said, surprised by the conviction in his own voice. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the first drops of rain began to fall. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street as Jake stepped out of the doctor's office, his mother's fevered words still echoing in his ears. She'd been delirious through the night, speaking of things that made his blood run cold, things about his father's death that didn't match what he'd been told for 15 years. "The mine wasn't an accident," she'd whispered, gripping his hand with surprising strength. "Samuel Blackwood, he knew about the silver vein. Your father was going to file the claim himself. Jake's boots hit the wooden planks of the boardwalk with heavy thuds as he made his way toward Blackwood's ranch. The weight of his Colt, 45, pressed against his hip, a cold reminder of the choice he'd made. 3 days had passed since Blackwood's ultimatum, and the rancher would expect an answer about the Turner property deed. But Jake had questions of his own now. The Blackwood estate sprawled before him like a monument to wealth built on other men's graves. Jake had always assumed the man's fortune came from cattle and land deals, but now he wondered how much of it was bought with blood. The ornate iron gates stood open, almost inviting, as if Blackwood had been expecting him. Inside the grand house, Jake found the rancher in his study, surrounded by maps and legal documents. Blackwood looked up from his desk with that familiar, predatory smile, but something in Jake's expression made him pause. "You look troubled, son. I trust you've come to accept my generous offer?" Jake stepped closer, his hand resting casually near his gun. "Tell me about the Paradise Creek mine." The color drained from Blackwood's face, though he recovered quickly. "Ancient history. What does that have to do with—" "My father died in that mine 15 years ago. You said it was a cave-in, an accident. But my mother's been talking, and her memory's getting clearer as her fever breaks." Blackwood stood slowly, his own hand moving toward the drawer where Jake knew he kept a pistol. "Your mother's dying, boy. Fever makes people say crazy things." She remembered the assay report, the one my father showed her the night before he died. Said there was enough silver in that mine to make a man rich for 3 lifetimes. Jake's voice was steady, but his eyes burned with controlled fury. "Funny thing is, right after the accident, you suddenly had enough money to buy up half the territory. You're walking on dangerous ground, Jake. My father was going to file that claim the morning he died. Instead, he got trapped in a tunnel that just happened to collapse while he was alone in there." Jake took another step forward. "How much did you pay the other miners to keep quiet? Or did they have accidents too?" Blackwood's hand finally found his gun, but Jake was faster. The Colt cleared leather in a smooth motion. The barrel trained on the rancher's chest before the older man could fully draw. "I wouldn't," Jake said quietly. Blackwood slowly raised his hands, but his eyes held no fear, only calculation. "You think killing me will bring your father back? Will save your mother?" "No, but it'll make sure you don't hurt anyone else. You kill me, and Dr. Henley stops treating your mother. The whole town turns against you. You'll hang, and she'll die anyway." Blackwood's voice was calm, reasonable. "But if you're smart, we can still make a deal." Jake's finger tightened on the trigger. "What kind of deal?" "The mine's played out now. I made sure of that years ago. But there's still money to be made, and I could use a man with your particular skills, someone who knows how to keep secrets." Blackwood smiled that cold smile again. "Kill Sheriff Morrison for me, and I'll make sure your mother gets the best care money can buy. She'll live, you'll be rich, and the past stays buried." "Morrison? What's he done?" "He's been asking the same questions you have, getting too close to things that need to stay hidden. 1 bullet, Jake. That's all it takes to secure your future." Jake stared at the man who'd killed his father, who'd built an empire on murder and lies. The offer hung in the air between them like poison. His mother would live. He'd have enough money to start over somewhere else. All it would cost was one more death, one more secret to carry. The sound of approaching horses drifted through the window. Jake glanced outside to see Sheriff Morrison riding up the long drive with 2 deputies. His mother must have told the doctor what she'd remembered, and the doctor had gone to the law. Blackwood followed his gaze and chuckled. "Looks like your time's up, son. What's it going to be? Take my offer and walk out of here a free man, or let Morrison arrest me and watch your mother die while lawyers argue over 15-year-old accusations?" Jake's hand trembled slightly as the horses drew closer. In moments, he'd have to choose between justice and love, between vengeance and survival. The dawn sun painted the desert crimson as Jake knelt beside his mother's bed, watching her chest rise and fall with the steady rhythm of peaceful sleep. 3 weeks had passed since Doc Harrison had declared her fever broken, since the clean water and medicine had pulled her back from death's doorstep. 3 weeks since he'd made his deal with Cornelius Blackwood. Today was the day that debt came due. His mother stirred, opening eyes that were clear and bright for the first time in months. "Jake, you're up early, son." "Just watching the sunrise, Ma." He squeezed her hand, memorizing the warmth of it. "How you feeling?" "Strong enough to make breakfast for my boy." She struggled to sit up, and Jake helped her, marveling at how much weight she'd regained. "That medicine's been a godsend, Jake. However did you afford it?" Jake forced a smile. "Don't you worry about that. You just focus on getting well." She studied his face with a mother's intuition. "There's something you're not telling me." Before he could answer, hoofbeats thundered in the distance. Through the window, Jake saw a cloud of dust approaching, 6 riders in black, led by Blackwood himself. The rancher sat his horse like a king, surveying his domain, his silver beard glinting in the morning light. "Ma, I need you to stay inside, no matter what you hear. Promise me." Fear flickered in her eyes. "Jake, what's going on?" "Promise me." "I promise, but—" Jake kissed her forehead and stepped outside, closing the door behind him. Blackwood dismounted with the fluid grace of a man half his age, his cold eyes fixed on Jake. "Time to collect, boy." Jake's hand instinctively moved toward his gun belt, then stopped. 5 armed men flanked Blackwood, their hands resting casually on their weapons. Even if he was fast enough, which he doubted, his mother would be caught in the crossfire. "I'm ready," Jake said quietly. Blackwood smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Good, mount up. We ride to Devil's Canyon." The name sent ice through Jake's veins. Devil's Canyon was where Blackwood's enemies disappeared, where the desert claimed bodies that were never found. As they rode, Jake's mind raced, searching for options, but each scenario ended the same way, with his mother alone and defenseless. The canyon walls rose around them, like the ribs of some ancient beast, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for Jake with skeletal fingers. Blackwood called a halt near a narrow ledge overlooking a 100-foot drop. "You know why we're here," Blackwood said, dismounting. "My generosity comes with a price. Your mother's life for yours. Fair trade, wouldn't you say?" Jake slid from his horse, his hand finally settling on his gun grip. "There's something you should know first." Blackwood raised an eyebrow. "Last words? How touching." "I know about the water rights. I know you've been poisoning the wells." For the first time, Blackwood's composure cracked. "Impossible." Jake pulled a folded paper from his vest, the document he'd stolen from Blackwood's study during one of his water deliveries. "All here in your own handwriting. Plans to contaminate every independent water source in the valley. Force the small ranchers to sell to you for pennies." "You little—" Blackwood lunged forward, but Jake was ready. The Colt cleared leather in a blur of motion, faster than Jake had ever drawn before. Blackwood froze, staring down the barrel, his face pale with shock. "Call off your men," Jake commanded. "You can't fight us all, boy." "Maybe not, but I can put a bullet in you before they drop me." "And that document?" "I made copies. Left them with Sheriff Martinez in town. If I don't return by sunset, he'll have everything he needs to arrest you for attempted murder and fraud." The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Finally, Blackwood laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Clever, very clever. But you think this ends here?" "I think it does." Jake's voice was steady, but sweat beaded on his forehead. "You're going to tear up our debt, restore the water sources, and leave my family alone. In return, you get to walk away from this canyon alive." Blackwood's eyes burned with fury, but he was a pragmatist above all else. Slowly, he reached into his coat and withdrew the contract bearing Jake's signature. With exaggerated care, he tore it in half. "This isn't over," he snarled. "Yes, it is." Jake backed toward his horse, gun still trained on Blackwood. "Because if anything happens to me or my mother, anything at all, those documents go to the territorial governor. Your empire dies with us." As Jake rode away from Devil's Canyon, the morning sun climbed higher, burning away the shadows. Behind him, he heard Blackwood's roar of rage echo off the canyon walls, but he didn't look back. By the time he reached home, his mother was waiting on the porch with fresh coffee and the kind of smile that made everything worthwhile. Some debts, Jake had learned, were paid not in blood, but in courage.